Hi there, this is the first in a series of Christmas Carol audiobook analysis with commentary and also with annotations. So the idea behind this is you can use it in a range of different ways. You can use it just as a podcast, as an audiobook, just to listen to. I will elaborate on some of the key quotations and talk them through. Or if you prefer, you can have it up in front of you and you can read along and copy the annotations into your text. I've also put a link in the bottom of the description of this video to this actual document so that you can have an example of it. I'm going to be putting the other ones up as I go as well over the coming weeks. So first of all, some of the quotes I've used in a few different colours, I've highlighted them, and I find that quite useful because then when I'm looking for particular quotations, I can scan and look for particular colours. There's lots of different ways that you can do this. One way you can do this is by character. I sometimes like to do it by themes, and I've done it by themes this time largely, although there are more themes than this. But I've tried to split it into the main four motifs, which is warmth, light, dark and cold, some elements of Christian and religious imagery, and then finally the supernatural. Okay, so there are also videos on my YouTube channel which go through some of the other ideas and the theories behind certain themes and characters, and also the preface as well. So have a look for those if you want more information. So in the preface, in the beginning of the novella, Charles Dickens writes this to the reader, and he says, "I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. So in this, Dickens is immediately setting up to us, the reader, that it is a Gothic ghost story to a degree, but he also wants to get across a message here. And this sort of establishes his role as an intrusive narrator as well. He puts a lot of his voice and himself into the novella. So stave 1, and I've started with a commentary, which again, as I've said, I'll put a link to this in the description for this video. But the opening stave of A Christmas Carol sets the mood. It describes the setting and introduces many of the principal characters, and it also establishes the novel's allegorical structure. So an allegory is a type of narrative in which characters and events represent particular ideas. So it relies a lot on symbolism, and we know that there's an element of parable here. There's an element of like a moral message, and some of the characters within, well, all of the characters within the novella represent certain things. So in this case, Scrooge represents greed, apathy, and all that stands in opposition to the Christmas spirit. Bob personifies those who suffer under the Scrooges of the world, the English poor, and Fred serves to remind the readers of the joy and good cheer of the Christmas holiday. So the opening section also highlights the novel's narrative style, which is a peculiar and highly Dickensian blend, wild comedy. So there is a description here of Hamlet, a passage that foreshadows the entrance of the ghosts, and atmospheric horror. There's a throng of spirits eerily drifting through the fog just outside Scrooge's window. So the allegorical nature of A Christmas Carol leads to relatively simplistic symbolism and a linear plot. So the latter is divided into 5 staves, each containing a distinct episode in Scrooge's spiritual re-education. But of course the narrative is fragmented because there are elements of flashback where Scrooge is taken to visit elements from his past, present and future. So the first stave centres on the visitation from Marley's ghost, the middle 3 present the tales of the 3 Christmas spirits, and the last concludes the story, showing how Scrooge has changed from an inflexible curmudgeon to a warm and joyful benefactor. And underlying the narrative and paralleling the more ostensible theme of moral redemption lies an incisive political diatribe. So there is a polemic element to this. So Dickens takes aim at the poor laws then governing the underclass of Victorian England. He exposes the flaws of the unfair system of government that essentially restricts the underclass to life in prison or in a workhouse. And Dickens' own father served time in debtor's prison, of course. And Dickens' sympathetic portrayal of Bob Cratchit and his family puts a human face on the lower classes, which is something that the Victorian mass of the time of the upper classes may not have seen. Remember that there's a quite a prominent thought that people are poor because they are idle and therefore deserve it. So through Scrooge's implicit defence of the poor laws, so his argument that prisons are the only charity he cares to support, and he dismisses the excuses of the indifferent upper class as an irresponsible, selfish and cruel defence. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Stave 1 and then I'm going to go back through and just analyse a little bit, so that if you don't want to listen to the analysis, you can just pause it there. Or if you're watching along, you'll see some of the analysis written down the side of the text anyway, so you can pause and make your annotations as you go. So you can use this however you like. Marley's ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change, for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge that there is anything particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, Dark Master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts, and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without, and although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily, "what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug!" "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them through around a dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly. "Uncle!" pleaded the nephew. "Nephew!" returned the uncle sternly. "Keep Christmas in your way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it!" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you, much good it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas amongst the rest, but I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys, and therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed, he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love!" growled Scrooge, as if that was the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, "and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well presented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are wanting comfort, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with the flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes, and had lighted a great fire in the brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug, being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as the Lord Mayor's household should. And even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog an even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop 1/2 crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'd be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blindman's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to the deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of a building up a yard, where it had so little business to be. that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The other rooms being all let out as offices, the yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any immediate process or change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The air was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid colour made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall, but there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom, thus secured against surprise. He took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod, and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on his surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again as he threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the higher story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange inexplicable dread that as he looked he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley, in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassel on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say, "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe me?" observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, A fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel, in his heart, by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, "notwithstanding." "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you. Humbug!" At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits work the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what I cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it, link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never rove beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow," the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and travelling all the time." "The whole time," said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast, said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward could have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. Oh, captive, bound, and double ironed, cried the phantom, not to know the ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business? Cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, the spectre said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, cried the ghost. My time is nearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me, don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. That is no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I'm here tonight to warn you that you have a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank you. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded, in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were wrought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer, and Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for, on the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms. wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been known personally to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power for ever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable, and being from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Okay, so that is the end of stave 1. So you can stop the video now if you've been reading along and pausing to make annotations. If you haven't, I'm just going to spend another 5 minutes just going through some of the key quotations in this stave. So I think that the initial one is really quite an interesting one. Marley was dead to begin with. So we've got the use of the colon here to emphasise this, and this is a fantastic opening to a novella, isn't it? We know, therefore, that he's not going to perhaps always be dead, which sets it in this sort of gothic supernatural tone. And that's repeated as we go through to sort of foreshadow the fact that he is going to soon be not dead or undead. We also get in this line here some interesting intrusive narration, like through the use of the exclamative here as well. Mind, I don't mean to say that of my own knowledge. It almost makes us feel like we have Dickens there in front of us, or at our elbow, as he suggests later in the novella, telling us this story as if it's something that has really happened, which again plays with this idea of it being sort of a real tale or moral parable versus the gothic supernatural element. This section here is quite interesting as well, where Scrooge, they've got the repetition of the word soul. Scrooge was his sole executor, sole assign. So it reminds the reader of the solitary life that Scrooge leads, but it also has connotations because of the homophone soul, meaning something inside you, which links to the idea of repentance, links to the idea of redemption and to salvation as well. We've then got a literary allusion, or you can call it intertextuality here, to Hamlet. And this is quite interesting because, like Hamlet's father, the ghost of Hamlet's father, it could be suggesting that Marley will come to chide, warn and instruct Scrooge, which we know he does. And Scrooge is obviously more in need here. And he needs this warning. So we've got a few different warnings and foreshadowing going on here. This is the first, probably most important description of Scrooge. It's quite fascinating because of the particularly cold imagery. Now, the idea of the cold imagery, the similes here illustrate his penuriousness, so his greed. But like an oyster, and that's probably one of the best quotes in the novella for Scrooge, he has this hard outer shell, but he contains something precious which is yet to be found, potentially. So there's an idea here, a little tiny inkling that perhaps Scrooge, although tight, could change. It's an interesting here that some people argue as well through this description of him, particularly with the pointed nose, that this could be presenting Scrooge as Jewish and therefore, linking it as an anti-Semitic text. But the name could also symbolise other things to do with the Old Testament versus the New. There's a video on this on my channel that you can have a look at if you want a bit more information. This next quotation here is quite interesting as well. Even the blind men's dogs appear to know him. Now, this idea of seeing isn't just about physical seeing, but the idea of blindness is also the idea of ignorance. Scrooge can't see the things that he should be able to see, and you know, the dogs here are suggesting that it's better to not see the world at all than see it in the way that Scrooge sees it, the darkness therefore symbolising Scrooge's ignorance. It then starts with once upon a time, and this is almost where the story actually begins. It's not a fairy tale, but it does have a happy ending. So there's an inkling there. But up until this point, it's just sort of giving us a little bit of the backstory, and this is where the action begins. Here we've got more elements of obscurity through the fog stopping Scrooge from being able to see, and that of course is a Gothic trope. And also the idea of it being quite cold. Scrooge is surrounded by warmth, symbolising generosity and charity, but he is unable to access it. He's isolated from it through his own actions at this stage of the novella. And these are quite interesting quotations because Fred is an allegorical character. He is the antithesis to Scrooge. He represents everything that Scrooge isn't or should be. So where one is described through very warm imagery, Fred, all in a glow, his face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled and his breath smoked again, whereas Scrooge is described through a lot of cold imagery, the ice and frost, for example, on his features. And then you can't really get their complete differences in viewpoints until you see these quotes. "I do," said Scrooge, "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." To which Fred replies, "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." So it highlights their differences in their attitudes to poverty, and Dickens is perhaps showing through Scrooge those Malthusian viewpoints of the time, the idea that you need money to be happy, and also sort of capitalist ideals, but also the idea that if you want to be happy, you would just try and work, because he doesn't quite understand poverty is not something that happens because people are idle. And eventually he replies to his nephew, "Keep Christmas in your way and let me keep it in mine." And this is interesting because I think it highlights the different ways people observe Christmas. Perhaps Dickens is trying to remind us of the Christian message around Christmas at this point, but there are other things as well. Like just down here it says, "Apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin," that, although it is an aside by Fred, that is Dickens reminding us that actually there is a reason that we celebrate Christmas. The word Christmas comes from Christ, and that there's we need to think about those religious elements as well as it being a kind, forgiving and charitable and pleasant time, some of the more humanitarian or secular ideas. But there are more references to religion, such as "God bless it," and the hyperbolic language there as well, and really emphasises it to a reader. And here again, we've got more wordplay. "Cold as he was warmer than Scrooge." And I think that again reminds us of a symbolic representation of cold versus warmth, which is generosity and greed. Scrooge, when he looks at his clerk talking about Merry Christmas, when he only earns 15 shillings a week, says, "I'll retire to Bedlam." And Bedlam was a psychiatric hospital in London at the time, and Scrooge is suggesting that that the clerk's mad to be so happy when he only earns 15 shillings a week, which of course is ironic because it is Scrooge that gives him 15 shillings a week and could pay him more. Back to the idea of religious imagery, we know that Marley has been dead these 7 years, and the number 7 has significance in many faiths. In the Bible, the creation took 7 days. It is the 7th day is Sabbath in Jewish faith, and in many cultures it signifies the end of the physical world and into the world beyond the physical. So this is like the supernatural world in this instance. But also in the commandments of Noah's children, it signifies the pursuit of justice, which again is quite interesting within the parable element of this novella, that Dickens is almost seeking a kind of justice from the Scrooges of Victorian society to help the poor and destitute. And he then goes on to describe them as the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries, hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts. So this is slightly hyperbolic language, but it's also accurate. And I think this is the reason why he set it at Christmas, because it is a time where those that want, that are without, feel it more keenly, and perhaps a time to enable a Victorian reader to be more charitable. Scrooge's response is quite fascinating because he's dumbfounded. Why should he give to charity? Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then? These are the sort of places that he feels he should be giving his money to, because that's where he feels the poor people should be. But as the charity men say, under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? So they're suggesting that you should do it to be kind because you have money and they don't, which is something at this point that he can't understand. He says, I can't afford to make idle people merry. He then goes on to say, if they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. And this links quite clearly with Thomas Malthus's work that looked at the fact that actually if you allowed poorer people to die, economically speaking, and you didn't feed them, then there would be more money to go around. We need to decrease the surplus population. And also, if we just return to the treadmills for a moment, treadmills were used for punishment during the Victorian era, and British engineer William Cubitt invented it, and it was installed for hard labour. So these treadmills were designed as a means to usefully employ convicts and their use of power to be productive. Sometimes they turned things and actually created energy. Sometimes they had no purpose but to keep people busy, because they really believed that people were poor because they were idle. And this is quite an interesting quote. It's enough for a man to understand his own business. It reminds me quite a lot of Mr. Burling's viewpoint in A Christmas Carol, in An Inspector Calls, because he says a man has got to look after himself. It's this sort of capitalist viewpoint. And then again, we return to more sort of Gothic imagery with the obscurity of the fog, and then the church. And this next section is quite good for looking at the antithesis between cold and warm and want and charity, describing the people that are desperately trying to keep themselves warm in a cold world, which has a symbolic level of as well, of course. But also the church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge. It's sort of reminiscent of God's omniscience, this idea that religion is obscured at this stage by the fog, but it's ringing out there and it's waiting for Scrooge's return. And this section describes various different people getting ready for Christmas and highlights the difference between the rich and the poor. And then we've got more religious imagery here. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, and indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. It's interesting reference, biblical allusion. But the St. Dunstan was a patron saint of goldsmiths, which links in with the idea of moneylenders. But he also attacked the devil with a pair of tongs, and this sort of emphasises the importance of coal, but also the importance of faith. There's a bit of humour there as well with the double entendre. So the fact that people are trying to invade his home with the sound of Christmas by singing through his door, we can see makes him incredibly angry. But it's not a good life, and we can see that through the representation of melancholy. This is a fantastic quote. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. There's so many different interpretations to that. Of course, it represents his ignorance in the darkness, but also the fact that he doesn't want to spend any money, but he perhaps wants to remain ignorant because that's easier than having to do anything to help others. Then again, more religious imagery through the description of the fireplace, that they've got the scriptures around it. There were Cain's and Abel's, Pharaoh's daughters, etc., and apostles. And then the fact that the face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole is fascinating. It's obviously an example of the supernatural because his face has just exploded in front of him. But in a way, Marley does act like a prophet. He's a person regarded as an inspired teacher or a proclaimer of the will of God. A prophet is, and Marley, he is here. He's come to give him a message of the other ghosts that are here to come, and perhaps therefore acting a bit like passing on the message of the will of God. And he does that through explaining his current situation. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. So Scrooge refuses to believe it, and there's a really great quote there. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. You might just be a bit of undigested bit of beef. Here's another bit of humour of Dickens where he's trying to subvert Gothic conventions, but it also adds an element of comic relief. We've got bathos going through this, so the idea of something really supernatural twisting to the natural, to the normal, and back, which creates sort of a tense effect. This is where we get to understand the reason that he is there. He asks why he's there, and he asks, but why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me? And he replies that that he wears the chain he forged in life. And we get this idea that Marley is condemned to walk the earth to pay for his sins. This is a bit like purgatory. Marley clearly feels regret and remorse for his actions, but it's too late for him. But it's not too late for Scrooge, which propels the plot, but it's also not too late for the reader. So when he says, I wear the chain I forged in life, there's a literal level there because he has a ghostly chain around him, but it's metaphorical. It's his sins weighing him down. And he is in purgatory, and this is, we get the allusion here in this line, there's no rest for the wicked, no rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. And again, we get this idea about capitalism versus humanitarianism, where he says, mankind was my business. We've got the repetition of business here, which illustrates that real contrast. And also we've got the venerating Christmas Day as part of the Christmas celebration in this quote here. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no homes to which its light would have conducted me? He didn't listen to the Christian message of Christmas, and it's become too late for him. And then again, the word penance. So really hammering home to Scrooge and the reader that this is a message, and actually he will be haunted by the ghosts, but he could be haunted by something much worse in time to come if he doesn't heed their warning and listen to their message. And it's a necessary part of the experience. He can't shun the path. So Scrooge is becoming more aware as this stave continues, and the spirits wandering around, he's able to see them. And we get, Marley mentions that he's been sat near Scrooge lots before and Scrooge hasn't seen him. So Scrooge is starting to have his eyes open now. He's starting to be able to see. And there's a moment where he looks out the window and he's able to see all of the phantoms wandering hither and thither in a restless haste. They're all of the lost souls, the souls in purgatory that have not been able to go on to heaven, who are trying to repent for their sins. And this shows that this sort of step from one world into the other, where he's seeing what could be. And then it ends in, we've got bathos here again. It ends with him just going home and and it all going completely back to normal and him just going to bed, which is an interesting way to end the stave before we move on to find out what happens in stave 2. Okay, so please, I'm going to upload the stave 2 in the same way, and let me know in the comment box if you found this useful or there's anything else that you might find supportive.